As the battle for Dallas and Fort Worth kicked off within the gigantic metroplex of some over 8 million people, within this amalgamation of cities, the downtown areas of both Dallas and also Fort Worth were highly coveted after the victory for use as red zones for the colonial and economic exploitation of the former nation, as the invasion was now well underway, having had initiated with the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes. 2 battalions were tasked with 2 separate sets of complementary objectives as it pertained to the combat occurring for the downtown of Dallas, as again the downtown was highly coveted intact for use post-invasion. Delicate operations were underway to ensure that this was captured successfully and as much intact as was humanly possible, utilizing the highly mobile forces of the 83rd Air Asslt Brigade, having had committed one of its Air Asslt battalions to the task of capturing the downtown intact. As the objective of downtown corresponded with the layout of this area, the different Air Asslt Infantry companies would be landed in the 4 cardinal directions on the boundaries of the downtown. This included to the west of the downtown, as these forces were initially landed on the western side of the Trinity River within the Trinity River Greenbelt Park, which actually was a floodplain that doubled as a park for the Trinity River and also was the western boundary of the downtown of Dallas. These forces would play a pivotal role in the capture of the I-30 bridge crossing, as this company would be very critical in ensuring that the armored forces of the Armored Bttn from the 16th Infantry Division of the PLA's Reserve 59th Group Army would be able to cross the I-30 bridge, as this was selected due to its ability to enable armored forces to cross the Trinity River, as this bridge could support heavily armored forces. As the first of 4 Air Asslt Infantry companies was already first 20 minutes of the combat, these forces would in effect take 45 minutes to completely capture and clear their initial objectives after first securing their LZ on the western side of the Trinity River, as the fighting to ensure the securing of the I-30 bridge as well as other local objectives immediately across the Trinity River were taking 45 minutes to achieve. Even as this battle was ongoing, the utility helicopters of the Transport Helicopter Company within this Air Asslt Bttn 20s, after dropping off their first Air Asslt Infantry Company, were already en route to pick up their second company and bring them to their objectives on the southern side of the downtown, which abutted the I-30 segment, which was the southern boundary of downtown itself. Capturing critical sites along this highway would enable these forces to have total control over this segment of the highway, enabling the unimpeded armored companies from the Armored Bttn, as this battalion would break up into 3 groups comprised of their armored infantry companies, each one going with 2 tank companies, to form a grouping that would exit the highway upon crossing the I-30 bridge and spreading out to move in an eastward direction through the downtown on its various streets, while the other grouping of maneuver companies, another armored infantry company and 2 tank, would continue along the I-30 segment in the south to then effectively swing north into Deep Ellum to surround the remains of the 2nd of the 198th, as some elements of this battalion would be lost in the initial strikes on the bivouac sites, while other company captains within this particular battalion would have taken great initiative upon the total grid down, comms down, and ISR down situation that had occurred, opening the invasion, thus moving their forces off their bivouac sites right as the strategic missile forces of China, namely the 612th and 613th, will have hit these sites with cruise missile strikes directed in by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, in addition to the massive artillery strikes hitting some of these bivouac locations. As the elements of the 19th Artillery Brigade, namely 3 firing battalions in a northern grouping consisting of one of 2 PLL-66 towed 152mm howitzer battalions, one of 2 PLL-01 towed 155mm howitzer battalions, and the single battalion of the very potent PHL-03 300mm multiple launch rocket systems, which were the most powerful artillery asset available within the 19th Artillery Brigade and the 59th PLA Group Army as a whole. These forces would contribute some of their comprising firing batteries towards the efforts occurring in the downtown combat in Dallas, as other comprising batteries within these battalions would be firing at other targets throughout the entire metroplex. The southern grouping of the additional 4 firing battalions consisted of the other PLL-66 towed 152mm howitzer battalion, the other PLL-01 towed 155mm howitzer battalion, and both Type-83 122mm multiple launch rocket battalions. The Type-83, of course, being an upgrade of the original PHL-81 family. As the 2 battalions of the Type-83s and 1 battalion of PLL-66s and the other battalion of PLL-01s in the southern grouping were firing at other targets. These would not play a role in the fighting in downtown. However, again, there was another battalion of PLL-66s and PLL-01s that did, as they had some of their comprising firing batteries assisting in this effort. As the PHL-03 battalion would play a pivotal role as it pertained to not only striking formations of armed reactionary civilians in the downtown area and its immediate outer vicinity, these rocket projectors would play an enormous role in conducting terrain denial strikes as well as disrupting and destroying enemy forces as it corresponded to the battle in the downtown area. As the Armored Bttn from the 16th Infantry Division was already moving towards their objectives in the downtown, as again there were 2 sets of objectives for each battalion. The Air Asslt Bttn, namely taking the downtown as much intact as possible, while the Armored Bttn from the 59th PLA Group Army's 16th ID was tasked with the sole objective of completely eradicating the 2nd of the 198th, an American Armored Battalion belonging to the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team, as this battalion, the 2nd of the 198th, was attached to the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, which was in command of the overall defenses for this particular battle space. As again, the Americans had no idea that a full-scale invasion was heading their way. They had distributed their forces, assuming that there would be some type of limited strikes, either conducted by air, missile, or perhaps by proxy-like forces, as the Americans were wise enough to understand that they had been infiltrated over the years due to failed border policies and other like policies, although they had no idea the level of infiltration was such that a complete 4th-generation warfare doctrine invasion had been put together, complete with Trojan shock forces with their full complement of their units' respective equipment and ammunition, as logistics had been stockpiled for literal decades, plural, as over 20 years had elapsed with the PLA, Russians, and other allied forces gradually importing their logistics through the CCP regime-owned ports and stockpiling them on their units' corresponding properties with full complement of weapons. As it pertained to the fighting for downtown Dallas, the coveted future red zone, which was the downtown with its buildings as much intact as possible, would be hurriedly seized by the air assault troops, as they would begin arriving even before the heavier armored forces coming from the 16th ID. as the 16th ID forces quickly and rapidly stopped to destroy small groupings of a few hundred armed reactionary civilians in two separate pockets, as it only effectively took one company from this battalion to destroy these forces, and even with artillery support, this was achieved exceedingly rapidly before they then arrived at the Trinity River I-30 bridge crossing, which by then will have long since been secured by the first landing Air Asslt Infantry Company of the corresponding Air Asslt Infantry Battalion tasked with the seizure of downtown. The second company would land in the south, the third in the north, on the northern boundary of the downtown, and the fourth and final Air Asslt Infantry Company on the eastern boundary of downtown to block the entry into downtown by the 2nd of the 198th forces, who were bivouacked in the easternmost end of downtown and mostly in Deep Ellum, which abutted the downtown on its eastern end. While the armored forces moved in, the armored battalion's forces, their comprising companies, moved in a manner where they had their maneuver companies in the front and the back, with the anti-tank and headquarters and support company, which was the command and logistical companies, in the middle of the column as they moved towards the downtown. In effect, there were 2 tank and 1 armored infantry companies leading the front. There were 2 tank and 1 armored infantry companies in the back, the anti-tank and headquarters and support company in the middle. And as they would arrive, the first 3 maneuver companies, 2 tank and 1 armored infantry, upon crossing the I-30 bridge, would spread out and face towards the east, whereas the follow-up 3 companies after the anti-tank company and headquarters and support company stopped on the west bank of the Trinity would continue crossing the I-30 bridge and continue along a short expanse of I-30 as they cross the I-30 bridge and swing around into Deep Ellum and trap the comprising companies of the American 2nd of the 198th, along with hundreds of armed reactionary civilians, mostly on the periphery of the downtown area, including in Uptown, which was north of downtown and abutted it from the north. It was actually called Uptown as an uptown area outside of downtown. Deep Ellum, another uptown area to the east. And in the south, there was a neighborhood called the Cedars and also South Dallas. There were other survivors of this grouping hit early on as they clustered together and tried to band together and figure out what was going on in the communications and grid down situation, and they made easy targets for artillery strikes, although survivors had raced into the downtown area that would be surrounded by the armored forces and permeated by the insertion of Air Asslt troops. And this combined grouping of hundreds of armed reactionary civilians and the 2nd of the 198th, the Armored Battalion of the Americans, would be completely surrounded and destroyed in this operation conducted by these 2 very different battalions. One quasi-elite Air Asslt Bttn coupled with the Armored Battalion from the 16th ID moving in from the southwest as they moved east. And as the 1st Air Asslt Infantry Company had been landed on the west bank of the Trinity River and had quickly secured their landing zones and were already within the first 45 minutes capturing their local objectives in this area, including total control of the I-30 bridge crossing, shortly near them, in the near distance, would be the landing of a platoon from the 2nd Company to be brought in, as the 2nd Air Asslt Infantry Company would land 1 full platoon on top of the Hutchinson Convention Center, which was immediately adjacent to the segment of I-30, which would be taken by 3 of the companies from the Armored Battalion that would swing around from the south and into Deep Ellum to surround the 2nd of the 198th, as in this area in the west, as the 3 combat platoons of 1 Air Asslt Infantry Company had landed to secure the local objectives, which included the county jail and courts complexes, where they also fought local paramilitary forces with their attack ELO gunships, with 25mm fire clearing these forces from the roof of the county jail. The Combat Aviation Company would remain in the western end of downtown to assist the landings occurring in the south and the north, as their weapons had more than enough range to reach these areas. The only issue being that in the downtown area there were a number of high-rise buildings and skyscrapers, and thus these attack ELO gunships had to array themselves in such a fashion to where they could see down the streets to be able to assist the landings of their troops with their very potent firepower, which included, again, their 25mm chain guns, their ATGMs, in this case being the AKD-21s that equipped these gunships, and they also had their 70mm rocket pods, which they would save for an emergency situation, as these could blanket an area between all of these gunships with an enormous amount of firepower, which was hellishly destructive. As the combat air patrols were occurring in this area, which included some J-10 fighter aircraft that were pictured here. There were also J-11s patrolling this area, as a pair of these would be flying around the north end of downtown. And although these aircraft had limited air-to-ground munitions, which typically included a single pair of laser-guided or even Baidu, which was satellite-guided, 1,000-pound munitions, they were mostly armed with air-to-air munitions to conduct their combat air patrols and ensure air superiority for the ground operations, at least during their first sortie, before returning later to be re-equipped with predominantly air-to-ground munitions to assist in airstrikes, as in close air support. For the meantime, however, artillery and the attack helo gunships of the Combat Aviation Company, along with also there being ample loitering munitions, would comprise the vast majority of the supporting assets of the ground troops in this operation. As the armored forces would eventually cross the I-30 bridge crossing, which again would be completely under the PLA control of the initially landed Air Asslt Company within 45 minutes, even before this fighting wrapped up, the utility helos of the 3 flying platoons of 5 Z-20s each of the Transport Aviation Company, upon landing their first Air Asslt Infantry Company, will have returned to the CCP regime property where this battalion was based to pick up the next Air Asslt Infantry Company and bring them in. As again, this was conducted within the first 20 minutes. They were already bringing in their next company, which again, a platoon would be dropped on the roof of the massive Hutchinson Convention Center, taking the roof accesses into this enormous building. So large was this structure that it even had a light rail station within it, as on the first floor, a light rail station was inside of the building itself and continued crossing I-30 to the south, where it would enter the neighborhood known as the Cedars, which was an outlying area of South Dallas, as it was called. And the DPD headquarters would also be taken by a full platoon of Air Asslt Infantry from the 2nd Company. The 3rd Company would land 2 of their squads on the City Hall, and they would send their last 3 squads of their platoon to land on individual bank buildings, as there were 3 skyscrapers, high-rise bank buildings that would be taken by a squad each. As they would encounter no armed personnel in these buildings, these would be quickly seized and secured, as these were relatively near I-30, and their quadcopter assets would be dispatched to monitor the area and thus be able to assist in targeting information if there were any enemy personnel in the area. As in the AI target-seeking mode for the ample numbers of loitering munitions would be assisted by the use of these recon assets, as would the targeting for the attack helo gunships and possibly artillery if and when sanctioned. As for the meantime, the 2nd Company coming in to land on the Hutchinson Convention Center, which was ever so slightly to the south and east of the first landing zone in the west of Dallas, this platoon would encounter no armed resistance whatsoever at all within the convention center itself. However, outside, a number of armed reactionary civilians in small groupings had moved north across the highway bridge, the street bridge here, into the downtown, into its southern end, and thus were targeted by fragmentation warhead-equipped CH-901A loitering munitions, as well as an AKD-21, which had hit this civilian technical, which had decided to leave the area upon seeing the helos landing on the roof in force of the 1st platoon of Air Asslt Infantry from the 2nd Company landing in the south. As to the south of I-30, in the Cedars neighborhood, was the DPD headquarters, which was deemed a priority target, if for no other reason than standard operating procedure, as it was the nerve center of the local paramilitary forces, the police and their SWAT units included in this, as, again, police can be considered a form of paramilitary, even if they were just local police. Headquarters was seen as a command and that needed to be secured, as the PLA would send another platoon just to capture this building, as this building was also not very far south of the I-30 segment that would be soon crossed by armored forces, as 3 of the maneuver companies out of the 6 maneuver companies, which would be 2 tank and 1 armored infantry, would again be continuing on I-30 to the south of downtown, while the other 3 companies, 2 tank and 1 armored infantry, would depart and enter the west end to move and gradually clear the downtown from the west, moving east. As in this area, as controlling this site would be important for removing local resistance from the local paramilitary forces, limited artillery strikes were called in from the howitzer-based artillery, both the PLL-66s and PLL-01s, used at this park and ride area, as this was immediately adjacent to the DPD headquarters. They had dispatched 2 of their SWAT team MRAPs and some of their personnel to guard this area. As the grid and comms had gone down, the local forces in the headquarters had contingency plans for such a situation, as most departments would, and they had immediately dispatched some of their forces outside of their building to secure the outside of their building, including an adjacent parking garage wherein they had parked 4 police SUVs and some personnel on the top floor of this garage, which all would be targeted by AKD-21 ATGMs from the attack helo gunships, 25mm chain gun fire, as well as loitering munition strikes from fragmentation-equipped loitering munitions, and even, again, limited artillery strikes in the park and ride parking lot adjacent to the Cedar Station for the light rail network, as this mauve color coding indicates that this is passenger rail, whereas brown color coding indicates freight rail. This was the Cedar Station for the light rail for the local trains, and this was just on Lamar Street, barely south of the I-30 segment that would be used by the armored battalions comprising 3 maneuver companies that would continue on this route to effectively surround the 2nd of the 198th, as this was being secured first by air assault forces landing in the vicinity of it. Slightly to the north and east of the Hutchinson Convention Center was the City Hall, where the 3rd and final combat platoon of the Air Asslt Infantry Company, the second to land in the south here, would effectively land 2 squads on the roof and their other 3 squads to 3 separate bank buildings, high-rises, skyscrapers, if you will. And these SWAT MRAPs, having drove the short distance from the DPD headquarters to the City Hall, as soon as the grid went down, were immediately targeted by attack helo gunships, firing AKD-21s, 25mm chain gun fire, including at personnel, as well as loitering munition strikes on some of the soft-skinned DPD SUVs, as well as a person out in the front of the City Hall. The City Hall had a unique structure, as it had support columns holding up the roof in the front, although the building had a slant in terms of its front windows. It had a slightly 30-degree slant from the base of it moving up to the front of it, and the top floor could be accessed through rappelling, as one squad would rappel into the top floor windows, another squad would take the stairs all the way down, and both squads would go from down to up to meet each other in the middle of the building, as this squad would take the stairs all the way down, clear the first floor, move up. This squad would clear the top floor and move down, and they would meet in the middle of the building. Upon having secured the City Hall, this area would be completely locked down and under control, as this was the seat of the city government of Dallas, and effectively this, of course, naturally was an important site to secure, as also due to the proximity of the segment of I-30, which was literally just off this map right here. Control of this building using quadcopter assets to patrol the area would ensure that no enemy personnel could move freely through this area without risking artillery or gunship or even loitering munition strikes. The same would be the case as soon as these 3 squads landed on top of the bank buildings. As they would clear these buildings, they would effectively find no resistance inside of them naturally, as there was no armed personnel inside of those bank buildings. All the PD personnel had been dispatched to the City Hall and outside of their own station to defend it, at least those that were within the local area. And thus, again, they were targeted by attack helo gunships, loitering munitions, limited numbers of artillery fire, artillery strikes from 152 and 155 shells, again coming from the firing battalions, some of their comprising batteries that were assisting in this effort, that targeted these areas for destruction as enemy personnel were found. As the Armored Battalion would move into the area, its leading 3 companies, the first to cross the bridge and enter the downtown. These, again, would be the companies that would fan out through the west end of downtown, which is its westernmost edges of the downtown itself, and move in an eastward direction, while the other 3 companies would take I-30 to surround the rest of the 2nd of the 198th by swinging north after exiting I-30 and block them in Deep Ellum, and a classic hammer and anvil maneuver would be conducted to destroy the 2nd of the 198th. The 4th and final Air Asslt Infantry Company, being landed into the easternmost end of downtown, would be there in a blocking position to prevent the 2nd of the 198th from entering downtown, and thus making it more difficult to destroy them, as the downtown had a myriad of buildings that the PLA wanted intact, and they naturally didn't want to destroy these buildings, so securing the downtown from its 4 cardinal directions was of the importance. 4th Air Asslt Infantry Company would also assist the armored forces in their battle against the 2nd of the 198th by preventing them from entering this part of downtown, and thus defending downtown, as this was a key objective needing to be taken intact. And again, that was the job of the Air Assault troops, as there were 2 separate sets of objectives, and they complemented one another, as the Air Assault forces had their objectives and the Armored Battalion's forces had theirs. As they moved in, they quickly cleared these small clusters of armed reactionary civilians before crossing and entering the city, leaving behind their anti-tank company with their very powerful AFT-10 ATGM systems, as their entire anti-tank company had the capability to fire 160 of these very powerful and long-ranged HJ-10 ATGMs before being reloaded, as the 20 vehicles of this company packed that much firepower. And with the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which was ISR directed, and the AI calculated the targeting information and putting together strike packages, ensured that these systems were absolutely devastating, as the lead 3 maneuver companies, crossing first, would naturally move into downtown before the anti-tank company arrived. 1 tank company of the Type-88C main battle tanks, without the support from their anti-tank company, which hadn't yet arrived, would end up clashing with an American tank company from the 2nd of the 198th. As the Americans had left their bivouac sites, they had sent one of their tank companies, their Alpha Company, to conduct a recon-in-force, as the artillery and missile strikes had come in and hit some of the bivouac sites they had just mostly fled from, although some had not made it out. They had realized that there was a major assault underway and had assumed incorrectly that there were enemy forces within the area, and thus would send a tank company to do a recon-in-force in the north of downtown, sending them from their Deep Ellum bivouac site to the northwest. As they would move into this area, the PLA tank company of one of 2 with an armored infantry company that had first crossed into downtown would be dispatched in the north to effectively interdict, cut off, and destroy this American effort at a recon-in-force, as the goal of the Americans was to recon the area, and due to there being a communications and ISR down, return back with the information they'd obtained after reconning the area and trying to find an escape route out of the area that was now under heavy assault, as artillery was now crashing down on the periphery of the downtown in multiple directions, although not hitting the downtown itself, of course, as, again, the PLA wanted the downtown as much intact as was humanly possible. Although there would be small instances of fighting within the downtown area itself, it would mostly involve armed reactionary civilians and the air assault troops. And even as the first companies of the Armored Battalion would cross, some of the armored infantry and tank forces would also engage armed reactionary civilians as well, including in the Clyde Warren Park and in its vicinity, which was the northern boundary of the downtown, as the fighting in Clyde Warren Park would involve a small armored battle between a PLA tank company and the American tank company that was moving to recon through this area. As loitering munitions would also play a role, as the many battalions operating in this battle space all had their own battalion-level combat drone sections capable of operating the TEL-based 48-tube system. Ample numbers of loitering munitions were constantly in the skies, and a fresh volley of heat round-equipped loitering munitions, which were superb against heavily armored vehicles like main battle tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, would assist in the tank battle that would occur between the PLA's very potent Type-88C main battle tanks and the American M1 Abrams tanks that would clash in the Clyde Warren Park and in the Woodall Rogers Highway spur tunnel beneath it. As the layout in this area was somewhat unique in the fact that a park was literally above the highway tunnel, there would be fighting both in the highway spur and above in the Clyde Warren Park itself. As the downtown was relatively constricted due to its grid-patterned layout of streets and its relatively tall buildings, the Clyde Warren Park, in effect, was a godsend for the armored forces in the fact that it gave them more room to maneuver than they would have had otherwise. And the tanks of both sides would effectively be maneuvering through this park area and firing at one another on the move, just as this Type-88C is firing a tungsten sabot round at an M1 Abrams main battle tank. As the loitering munition, the CH-901A, is equipped with a heat round, it too is on AI target seeking mode, honing in on a target across the park from these PLA armored positions. The 10 would figure into the combat in the downtown area a bit later, as an even larger battle would develop on the eastern periphery of the downtown of Dallas, as the entire armored battalion by then will have made its way in, along with all of the ground-based forces flown in from the Air Asslt Bttn, as the initial landing operations were to establish control over small objectives within the larger objective of downtown, such as controlling key buildings, before then beginning to move up the streets on either side, clearing the buildings throughout downtown. And again, they would be slightly assisted in this effort by the movement of the different platoons belonging to the three maneuver companies that were moving from west to east in the downtown itself upon having first crossed the I-30 bridge, as the first three companies would move and fan out on the city streets, while the last three maneuver companies, the last two tank and one armored infantry, would continue on I-30 to surround and assist in the destruction of the 2nd of the 198th. Again, the objectives of the Air Asslt Infantry and the armored troops went hand in hand, as the Air Asslt Bttn and the Armored Battalion of the 16th ID, as the Air Asslt Bttn was part of the active duty PLA 83rd Group Army's 83rd Air Assault Brigade, had corresponding objectives. As the Air Assault troops sought to seize control of the downtown intact and the armored forces sought the complete destruction of the 2nd of the 198th, these goals were very complementary, and these forces would assist each other in the achievement of these two different sets of objectives. As the second company was now conducting their landing, as soon as they were landed, the utility helos, the Z-20s, were already returning to pick up platoons from the third company to land them in the north of the city to begin their operations therein. As the Hutchinson Convention Center was taken effectively without a fight, and the groupings of armed reactionary civilians from surrounding neighborhoods, such as the Cedars, were in this area being hit by small-scale artillery precision strikes that were ISR directed, with the real-time AI battlefield data processing system putting together the strike packages and the AI target-seeking mode with the loitering munitions with fragmentation warheads, also AKD-21 ATGMs and 25mm fire from the supporting Z-10 attack helo gunships of the Combat Aviation Company of the Air Asslt Bttn. These troops captured this building exceedingly rapidly, and although there was limited fighting inside the DPD headquarters, most of the heaviest fighting occurred outside, as these forces had been dispatched in the surrounding area to secure the facility, and many were hit by 25mm chain gun fire, AKD-21 ATGMs, and fragmentation, equipped loitering munitions with, again, limited artillery strikes from 155 and 152 millimeter shells in the park and ride parking lot by the Cedars Light Rail Station. As these troops of this platoon rapidly took the roof access into the building, heavy combat was now occurring inside the building, although again, the resistance they would face inside the building was minimal compared to what they would face outside. The officers of the DPD just simply did not have the training and the weaponry and the capabilities that these quasi-elite PLA air assault troops had, and as a result, with the real-time AI battlefield data processing system guiding these troops in their movements by giving them the entire layouts of the buildings they raided, as well as also other forms of intelligence reports, as well as guiding them on their tactical movements and the weapons they even utilized in certain situations. The ISR and real-time AI battlefield directed operation went off as smoothly as possible with very minimal casualties in the sense of troops that were wounded in very minor ways, such as taking hits in their extremities. And as a result, the entire DPD headquarters building was overtaken in a matter of 30 minutes as the troops went in their stack team formations as single squads broke into 5-man stack teams as the squads would break in half, and each stack team would take a side of the hallway. They would go from office to office, from hallway to hallway, room to room, and even clear large office rooms such as this, and tailor their tactical formations accordingly, as this stack team had thrown in a hand grenade before rushing in with 2 men laying down suppressing fires. This was a large room, and they already had the intel from their combat data link as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system guided them on all their movements. They left 1 soldier in the hall as per SOP to watch their 6 o'clock, while the 4 men of this 5-man stack team ran in laying suppressing fire, with this grouping of 2 moving around them as they laid their suppressing fire, and then they would begin to bound and cover tactically through this large office room. And they again tailored their tactical formations according to room size and layout and the intel reports received. And as they would raid smaller rooms, they would leave a soldier outside and send 4 men in, with each one running and shooting and taking a corner, yelling clear, and moving out and rejoining the stack team and continuing down the hall. This operation was a well-timed and well-coordinated operation and was running flawlessly and very smoothly. As this was a very surgical operation, the capture of these buildings was highly important, not only for the command and control reasoning behind the capture of the DPD station, but also its close proximity to the I-30 segment needing to be crossed by the armored companies of the Armored Bttn that were to move in and surround the companies of the 2nd of the 198th that were in Deep Ellum in East Dallas, the downtown area. As now, with this operation ongoing, and the company having had been landed in the south, including taking the city hall and 3 bank buildings, which this image is effectively conveying, as these troops are landing in a diamond formation and about to go down the roof access to clear the building. Another building, having had been taken, had the CCP regime party flag and national flag of China. These forces, again, these areas to conduct their targeting reconnaissance with their quadcopter assets in order to hold down large swathes of the downtown before then exiting their freshly secured landing zones and then proceeding down the streets, going building to building. As these platoons had been landed, again, the helos would leave immediately to pick up platoons from the 3rd Company, who would then be landed in the north of Dallas. And as this landing was wrapping up of the 3rd Company already, being landed in an hour and 15 minutes into the entire invasion already, as these troops could be brought in very rapidly from their location on their CCP regime property to the downtown insertion sites, their LZs. In the north, the image depicted here is the north end of downtown. This is the northernmost boundary of downtown. This is the Woodall-Rogers Spur, including the Spur Tunnel beneath the Clyde-Warren Park. This highway spur connects I-35E, which was a major objective, as I-35 is the primary invasion route into the heart of America from Mexico, as this was the most important of all the different invasion routes. This segment through downtown, as downtown was to be captured as much intact as possible, was of the utmost importance, just as important as the I-30 crossing and the segments of I-30 in the south. As this was captured within the first 45 minutes of this area falling, the second company being brought into the south of the downtown, followed by the third company being brought into the north, corresponded with the first three companies crossing the I-30 bridge by this point and beginning to fan out, the 2 tank and 1 armored infantry company. In the north, the northernmost tank company was dispatched through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system as the high-altitude satellite and quadcopter low-altitude reconnaissance assets had seen all the American movements, including them sending one of their tank companies to conduct their recon-in-force. The northernmost PLA tank company was dispatched to cut them off, interdict, and destroy them, and prevent them from trying to escape the downtown to conduct their recon and then again report back to the main body of their battalion. As in the north, heavy 300mm rocket strikes were coming in and hitting the uptown area, as to the north of the Clyde-Warren Park is the uptown area of Dallas, known as Uptown, as it was actually called that, which consisted of a large number of residential high-rise apartment buildings, also smaller apartment buildings, small businesses, and more. And this area had a number of armed reactionary civilians, several hundred, and they were all being rocketed by 300mm strikes, which also had the secondary purpose of being a terrain denial strike that would prevent American escape just in case the PLA tank company was unable to effectively interdict and destroy them first. And as a combination of efforts, the Air Asslt Infantry were also in the north of downtown, as this was known as the Arts District. This was an area that featured large museums, churches, and other businesses, but mostly a lot of museums, as well as the Clyde-Warren Park, and again, up north. This is a Deep Ellum marker in a deep elevated area below the Clyde-Warren Park, and as a result of the Americans sending one tank company from their original bivouac sites to the northwest where they would enter this area, one was in the north of downtown, now moving into this area, as the last and final platoon of Air Asslt Infantry was being landed in this area as 2 attack helo gunships, the Z-10s, had broken off of the Combat Aviation Company to assist them in their landing efforts, as 2 other platoons had already been landed, with the helos already returning to pick up the 4th and final company, with the first platoons being brought to the east. This 3rd and final company would be landed, as this was a touch-and-go, high-tempo operation. As soon as they were landed, these helos would return and pick up the last platoon from the 4th company of Air Asslt Infantry. This was all being done very fast. The attack helo gunships used their 25mm chain guns to destroy these armed reactionary civilians behind these buildings on this block. They also assisted the tanks in destroying this technical and these armed civilians here. And there were armed reactionary civilian pockets being fired at by coax machine gun fire, heavy turret machine gun fire from the main battle tanks, even frag T-shells, and also these fresh volleys of loitering munitions, CH-901As, equipped with the heat warheads, would assist in destroying armed civilian technicals and personnel on the roof, as this was a high priority target, even though there were no time already to put Molotovs together this early into the invasion. Anyone seen on a roof with a weapon by the AI target seeking mode was automatically a high priority target, because weapons used from high places was seen as a major threat by the AI system, and rightly so, as Molotovs could be used from high places, as could anti-tank weapons, which these armed civilians didn't have, but again, that mattered little, as the AI target-seeking mode deemed them as a threat nonetheless. These tanks, entering into the Clyde Warren Park, were now beginning to use the open space to their advantage and maneuver into this area, as this tank platoon here was now sending its tanks into the park to maneuver to engage this American tank platoon, with the 5th tank being the company captain's tank from the headquarters platoon. As they moved into the area, they were firing at one another, exchanging shells, firing on the move, and they were hitting one another with different types of ammunition. The Americans beginning to fire heat ammunition, or high explosive anti-tank, which did nothing to the Type-88C's explosive reactive armor, and as a result, the Type-88Cs returned fire with their very powerful tungsten sable ammunition and depleted uranium rounds, as their 125mm main guns were very powerful, especially with the ammunition types paired with them. As the lead tank moved here, as this tank moved into this area, this American tank had fired a depleted uranium shell, completely destroying this tank and killing its crew. The PLA headquarters platoon, just off the map, sent in their armored recovery vehicle to pick up the remains, as well as combat medics. And as these tanks maneuvered into place, they fired at the American tanks, destroying all of them, and there were also loitering munition hits. Again, it was not uncommon at all whatsoever for multiple systems to hit the same target. These were simply DH-10A long-range cruise missiles moving through the area, as well as right here, to hit different targets that were outside of this area, as the DFW Battle was a massive battle and there were many targets located all throughout the city. These were simply passing through the area to hit other targets, while these armed reactionary civilians, including those on the roof, were hit by loitering munitions. Even though they were armed with heat warheads, they could still wipe out these armed civilians, as these were mostly equipped with heat to deal with American armor, as again, it was well known that the 2nd, the 198th, was in the area, and thus the volley fired was of the heat warhead variety of CH-901As. As this platoon, the northernmost tank platoon, moved up this street in Uptown, on the Uptown side of the Woodall-Rogers Spur, the tanks here had staggered weapons to deal with threats, as again, this was an urban area and